now we have Professor Harry S. Silverstein, who's Professor Emeritus in the Philosophy Department here at WSU. Harry has published in many of the top journals in philosophy and co-edited 4 different volumes of the Topics of Contemporary Philosophy series published by the MIT Press. Causation and Explanation, which was published in 2007, Knowledge and Skepticism, Time and Identity, and Action, Ethics, and Responsibility, all published in 2010. Harry also co-directed the Inland Northwest Philosophy Conference on several different occasions. During his 30-plus years as a faculty member here at WSU, Harry was a beloved and popular teacher, and he served as the sole advisor for students in the philosophy department. In many ways, he is indeed a terrific role model for all of us. Join me in welcoming Harry Silverstein back to campus. So Harry said he's going to speak for about 30-40 minutes. We'll open up for Q&A after that.
Well, I'd like to start by saying that I think it's a great honor to talk under the auspices of the Foley Institute. Tom Foley was our representative when we first came to Washington State, and for a number of years thereafter. Not as many years as we would have liked, but for quite a few. And I might also note that both Lorinda, my wife, and I had high hopes at the last election that the 5th District would finally get a representative who was a worthy successor to Tom. Well, maybe next time. Okay, my topic today is moral responsibility. And if you can't hear me, let me know right away, okay? Specifically, I will focus on the conception according to which we are morally responsible for what we could have avoided, not responsible for what we could not have avoided. This is a fairly common, though controversial, conception. All philosophical conceptions, of course, are controversial. And on the surface, at least, it should seem plausible. For example, if a doctor's patient dies, then it seems reasonable to say that if the doctor had an alternative treatment available to her that would have prevented that death, then she is responsible for it. Whereas if she had no such alternative treatment, then she is not responsible for it. And I will argue that this conception is basically right. However, there are cases for which this conception gives what many people, including some philosophers, intuitively feel is the wrong result. And in this talk, I will focus on a well-known example of such a case, one which is commonly known as the case of Jim and the Indians. It comes from Bernard Williams in a 1973 book entitled Utilitarianism For and Against. The first half was written by J.J.C. Smart and is an argument for utilitarianism. Williams wrote the second half, which is an argument against utilitarianism. Like most philosophers' cases, it's a made-up, hypothetical case. And here it is, and it's given on your handout. Jim finds himself in the central square of a small South American town, having gotten there by accident while on a botanical expedition. Tied up against the wall are a row of 20 Indians. By the way, about the terminology, I think this was all done before the introduction, or at least the popularization of the more politically correct terms like Native Americans, indigenous peoples, and so on. I don't think, by the way, that Bernard Williams himself would have given a damn about American PC principles in any event. But so I will use the term Indians. The captain in charge explains that the Indians are a random group of the inhabitants who, after recent acts of protest against the government, are about to be killed to remind other possible protesters of the advantages of not protesting. However, since Jim is an honored visitor from another land, the captain is happy to offer him a guest's privilege of killing one of the Indians himself. If Jim accepts, then as a special mark of the occasion, the other Indians will be let off. Of course, if Jim refuses, then there is no special occasion, and all the Indians will be killed. Jim, with some desperate recollection of schoolboy fiction, wonders whether, if he got hold of a gun, he could hold the captain and the rest of the soldiers to threat. But it is quite clear from the setup that nothing of that kind is going to work. What should he do? So the choice is clear. He accepts the offer and he kills one Indian, but the other 19 go free. Or he refuses the offer and they are all killed. Now, Williams does not claim flatly that Jim should refuse the offer, but he does say that it's at least not obvious that he should accept it. And many people, including some philosophers, and including, I would say, about half of my students, when I first introduced this case in my classes, did and do say that Jim should refuse it. But my view, to put it as bluntly as possible, is that refusing the offer would be not merely morally wrong, but morally outrageous. For refusing the offer results in the deaths of 19 people that could have been saved. So what's the rationale for refusing? Well, a central part of it is a conception of responsibility, which is different from the avoidability conception that I'm defending, and which I think is quite mistaken. Now, I'll get to that issue shortly, but after some points of clarification. First, Jim's choice is commonly understood as a choice between a utilitarian alternative and an anti-utilitarian alternative. Accepting the offer being the utilitarian alternative, refusing it being the anti-utilitarian alternative. And this way of understanding the choice is hardly surprising, not only because this example was introduced in the context of a debate for and against utilitarianism, but because Williams himself understands it this way. But I think this way of understanding it is totally wrong. I myself am very strongly anti-utilitarian, and yet I equally strongly support Jim's accepting the offer. To explain the background a bit. Very roughly, utilitarianism, as I expect most of you know, is the doctrine that we should maximize utility, traditionally understood as pleasure or happiness. So the idea is that to decide what to do, you should determine which of your alternatives would maximize net happiness, meaning unhappiness minus unhappiness, and then choose that alternative. Okay, the standard objection to utilitarianism, an objection I and many others think is decisive, is that it conflicts with justice, with the protection of individual rights. As this point is sometimes put, utilitarianism sacrifices the rights of the minority to the welfare of the majority. Suppose, for example, that we could slightly increase overall net happiness by making 10% of the population slaves of the other 90%. Now this, of course, is a typical philosopher's hypothetical case, and you're no doubt thinking it's very unrealistic because it's highly unlikely that such a policy would increase overall happiness. Although I think we can stipulate details that would make it the supposition that it would increase happiness alarmingly plausible. But anyway, the crucial question is, suppose it were true that such a policy would slightly increase overall net happiness. What would we say then? And I assume we would all still say that the slavery policy would be horribly wrong. The slight happiness increase does not justify the horrific violation of the rights of the slaves. Okay, turning back to Jim's choice, we see that it really has nothing to do with utility versus rights. For the rationale for accepting the offer, the supposedly utilitarian choice, is that it prevents the violation of a basic right, the right to life, of 19 people not that it maximizes happiness. So Jim's choice is really all about rights. And this brings us to the next point. For significantly, and not surprisingly, given what I've just said, the arguments given in favor of the view that Jim should refuse the offer do not, in fact, appeal to the notions of right and justice, but to something quite different, specifically to what is required for Jim to maintain his own moral integrity, that's Williams's word, or his purity or righteousness, or perhaps the most common phrase, what is required to keep his own hands clean. Now, I think the assumption that Jim keeps his hands clean by refusing the offer is a mistake that follows directly from this view's mistaken conception of responsibility, and I'll return to that point shortly. But first, I want to argue that even if refusing the offer did keep Jim's hands clean, while accepting the offer didn't, the notion that keeping one's own hands clean has the moral importance that this view requires is itself morally outrageous. For consider what would be going through Jim's mind if he refused the offer on this basis. He would in effect be thinking, well, of course it's too bad about the 19 people dying, but that's okay because I'm doing the important thing. I'm keeping my own hands clean. Keeping his own hands clean, that's more important than preventing the deaths of 19 innocent people. Hopefully you can understand why, in one of my articles, I've called this sort of attitude an attitude that I think involves extreme self-absorption, moral narcissism. And it's an attitude that it's easy to fall into and can infect various areas of morality. For example, think of the common view that for an act to be virtuous, it must be done for the sake of virtue. You have to be very careful how you interpret this claim to avoid falling into narcissism. Suppose, for example, that Bill spends a whole day being very kind to a poor family that has suffered various misfortunes. He provides them with food, he helps them figure out which agencies they should go to for help, and he goes with them to a few such places to make sure they will be properly served, and so on. Well, imagine that at the end of the day, someone says to Bill, wow, you obviously have great sympathy for that family and their misfortunes. But then suppose Bill responds, oh no, I really couldn't care less about that family. I was simply doing what I needed to do to be able to check off the kindness box on my virtues chart. Well, if that's what constitutes acting for the sake of virtue, it's just an instance of narcissism. And in my view, certainly, whatever virtues Bill may have, kindness is not really one of them. So, in sum, even if the assumption that refusing the offer would keep Jim's hands clean while accepting it wouldn't, even if that assumption were correct, I think refusing the offer would still be outrageously wrong. But we're now ready to return, finally, as I promised we would, to the concept of responsibility. For this assumption, I think, is not correct because it's based on a mistaken conception of responsibility. A conception which I will label, admittedly dismissively, the other conception. Now, what the other conception clearly assumes is that if Jim accepts the offer, he is responsible for the death of the Indian he shoots, whereas if he refuses the offer, he is responsible for none of the deaths. But the avoidability conception that I'm defending gives the opposite result. On the one hand, it says that if Jim refuses the offer, he is responsible for the deaths of the 19 Indians who would not have died if he had accepted the offer. For he had an alternative that would have avoided that result. And on the other hand, it says he is not responsible for the death of the Indian he shoots if he accepts the offer, for he had no alternative that would have avoided that result. Now, to avoid extraneous complications at this point, I'll assume the Indian Jim shoots would have been killed by the soldiers at the same time and in the same way if Jim had refused the offer. So on this conception, what I think is the correct conception, if Jim refuses the offer, his hands are not clean. Even if he's standing off to the side with his hands in his pockets while the soldiers shoot all 20 Indians, his hands are in effect drenched in the blood of the 19 Indians he could have saved. And on the other side, if he accepts the offer, his hands are clean, even with respect to the Indian he shoots, for that Indian would have died at the same time and in the same way whether Jim shot him or the soldiers shot him. So if we apply the appropriate conception of responsibility, the notion of keeping one's own hands clean actually supports accepting the offer, not refusing it. So or at least an obvious question is, why does the other conception of responsibility, and with it the judgments I have castigated as expressing moral narcissism, seem attractive to so many people? Well, there are various possible reasons for this, but I'll just mention two. First, a view about how the concept of causality works and how that concept relates to responsibility. And secondly, a view about how responsibility spreads or does not spread across different ages. Looking first at the concept of causality. On the one hand, it initially seems reasonable to say we are responsible for what we cause, not what we don't cause. But on the other hand, it also seems natural, at least to many people, to say that the concept of causality does not exactly map the avoidability conception of responsibility. In particular, causality does not seem to relate to omissions in the same direct, straightforward way that it does to actions. And this distinction is directly relevant to Jim's case. On the one hand, if Jim accepts the offer and shoots the one Indian, then it seems very natural to say that he is the one who caused that Indian's death. He pulled the trigger that sent the bullet through the Indian's head, as a result of which the Indian died. In short, the relevant action was his. On the other hand, if he refuses the offer, then the relevant action is performed by the soldiers. Jim didn't do anything, he was just off to the side with his hands in his pockets. Now we can simply respond to this by saying, okay, if that's how you want to use causality, what follows is simply that responsibility does not map causality, for the avoidability conception of responsibility remains as plausible as ever. But I think we can say a bit more than this. First, the concept of consequences does not seem as closely tied to action as the concept of causality. And indeed, it seems to come at least very close to mapping the avoidability conception of responsibility. For example, even if it seems odd to say that Jim's refusal caused the deaths of the 19 Indians, it seems less odd, in fact, I don't think it seems odd at all, to say that those 19 deaths were a consequence of his refusal. But at the same time, the concepts of consequences and causality are very closely linked. Normally, if Y is a consequence of X, we would say X is a cause of Y. Moreover, the naturalness of tying causality more closely to actions, and this may be what is crucial, can plausibly explain on the basis of things other than the substantively relevant features of the concepts of causality, action, and omission. For one thing, there are many sorts of circumstances in which, in the overwhelming majority of cases, the relevant action is the only causally relevant component. And this definitely applies to cases of shooting people through the head. It's natural to suppose that Jim's shooting caused the Indian's death because in 99.9999% of the cases in which someone shoots a bullet through a person's head, that shooting is straightforwardly the cause of the person's death, because the death would not have occurred were it not for that shooting. But of course, the problem in Jim's case is that this final crucial element is lacking. To turn to another point, and I'll just mention this briefly, actions are typically very visible and thus occupy the forefront of our consciousness, whereas omissions are not. Indeed, we are often not aware of relevant omissions and the backstory relating to them at all. And of course, that affects our causality judgments. If a hunter, for example, wandered into this camp and watched the soldiers shoot all 20 Indians, he would of course think that the cause of all 20 deaths, including the 19 deaths that Jim could actually have prevented, was simply the shootings by the soldiers. He would know nothing about the offer made to Jim and his failure to accept it. But of course, given those additional circumstances, the causal relationships become more complicated. So I think that the naturalness of supposing that causality is more closely related to actions than omissions does not provide any basis for questioning the avoidability conception of responsibility. And the second view I want to discuss, the view involving the ascription of responsibility to different agents in the same case, fares no better in this regard. On this view, if Jim refuses the offer, then the soldiers are the ones responsible for the deaths of the 19 Indians he could have saved. They are, after all, the ones who did the shooting. And if they are the ones responsible, then Jim can't be. But the final step in this argument is the problem, and it is in fact confused. It is quite true, even on the avoidability conception, that the soldiers are responsible for the deaths of the 19 Indians, for they also had an alternative, not shooting, which would have avoided those deaths. But it doesn't follow that if the soldiers are responsible, Jim isn't. Responsibility is not some sort of zero-sum game. Many agents can be responsible, fully responsible, for the same outcome. So we can properly say that both Jim and the soldiers are fully responsible for those deaths, and others as well. The captain for giving the order, maybe the government for adopting the draconian policy that the captain is implementing, and so on. The crucial point here is that full responsibility is not the same as sole responsibility. Jim is not solely responsible for the 19 deaths, but he is fully responsible. And note that this point, that many agents can have full responsibility, is quite properly recognized by our criminal justice system. If a bank is robbed by a gang of 5, and they are then all caught, tried, and convicted, and the law specifies 30 years in prison as the appropriate sentence, the court would obviously not say that, well, 30 years is the sentence, so we have to divide that among these 5 so they each get 6 years. No, no, no. It would rather impose the full 30-year sentence on each of them, which is just to say it would judge each of them to have full responsibility. Well, at this point, I want to discuss further the stipulation that the Indian Jim shoots, if he accepts the offer, will be killed at the same time and in the same way if he refuses the offer. because this, in a way, makes it easy for me. That's what makes it possible to say, well, Jim has no responsibility for any relevant thing if he accepts the offer, not even for the death of the Indian that he shoots. But what happens if we make it harder? Suppose, to change the case, that if Jim accepts the offer, he will be required to shoot a particular Indian, an Indian named Carlos. Whereas if he refuses the offer, the soldiers will shoot only the other 19, letting Carlos go free. Well, in this case, Jim is responsible for Carlos's death if he accepts the offer. There's no way around that, for he had an alternative that would have avoided that result. Or to make it perhaps even more agonizing, for in this changed case, Jim still has a choice between 19 deaths and just one. Suppose there are only 2 captured Indians, Carlos and Manuel, and if Jim accepts the offer, he will shoot Carlos, but Manuel will go free. Whereas if he refuses it, the soldiers will shoot Manuel, but Carlos will go free. In this case, I think the likely response of most people, including those of you who have been willing to stay on my bus so far, is that Jim should definitely refuse the offer on the ground that, as it would typically be expressed, accepting the offer would be playing God, and we have no right to play God. But in terms of the avoidability conception of responsibility, that's a confusion. It's quite true that if Jim accepts the offer, he is responsible for Carlos's death, for he had an alternative that would have avoided that. But it's equally true that if he refuses the offer, he is responsible for Manuel's death, for he had an alternative that would have avoided that. In short, in this unfortunate situation, Jim cannot avoid playing God, for his choice, which he cannot get out of, determines who lives and who dies. And note that there are real-life situations where people have to make such choices. A medic in wartime, for example, might be confronted with 2 severely injured soldiers, each of whom will probably live if treated, but will certainly die if not treated, where the medic doesn't have the time or resources to treat both. Here he has no choice but to choose who lives, or probably lives, and who dies. And obviously he should treat one soldier or the other. I mean, burying his head in the sand and saying, I can't do anything, is the worst possible choice and the worst possible way of playing God. Now he would be responsible for both deaths. And as I understand it, people who have been in such circumstances are typically, and I think quite rightfully, scornful and dismissive of the claim that you can't play God. Well, returning to Jim, he is thus no less responsible for a death if he refuses the offer to shoot Carlos than if he accepts it. And one reason it's important to understand this is that there may be positive reasons for thinking Jim should accept the offer, because given that one Indian has to die, it would be preferable that it be Carlos. For example, it might be that Carlos is 80 years old in poor health, whereas Manuel is a healthy 21-year-old. Now, we may, of course, have different views about whether and to what extent that provides an acceptable reason for Jim's accepting the offer. You might still think Jim should just, in effect, flip a coin. But what we cannot say is that Jim would play God less by refusing the offer than by accepting it. Well, I think we have encountered no convincing objection to the avoidability conception of responsibility. So can we conclude that it's a complete and correct conception that an outcome's being avoidable for an agent is both necessary and sufficient for the agents being responsible for it? Have we solved the problem of responsibility and can now move on to something else? Of course not. In the end, we cannot say that this conception provides either necessary or sufficient conditions for responsibility. I'll say a bit about each, starting with sufficient conditions. The avoidability conception constitutes a version of what are called the freedom or freedom-relevant conditions for responsibility. But it doesn't provide sufficient conditions because the freedom conditions are not the only required conditions. There are others, the most prominent of which is probably the so-called knowledge condition. If you neither knew nor should have known that your action would have a certain outcome, then you would not be judged responsible for it, even if you had an alternative that would have avoided it. If a door to a public building, for example, has been rigged so that it would set off a bomb the next time it's opened, a fact that you were totally and quite justifiably unaware of, then you would not be responsible for the bombing if you were the unlucky person who next opened the door. But more troublesome, I think, is the fact that the avoidability conception does not provide even a necessary condition of responsibility. This is shown perhaps most clearly by cases where the outcome is, to use the standard term, overdetermined. Frankfurt cases are a special version of such cases, but they involve complexities that we cannot get into here. So I'll focus on more straightforward overdetermination cases. Suppose, for example, that George and Jeff are snipers for hire, that they are both commissioned by different agencies to assassinate a certain political figure at the same time on the same day, though neither is aware of the other's commission. That firing from different rooftops, they each fire a bullet through the target's head, the two bullets hitting the target's head at exactly the same time, and that either shot by itself would have killed the target instantly. Who is responsible for the death? Well, what we want to say, of course, that they should both be held responsible, indeed fully responsible. Again, if they were tried in criminal court, the court would surely impose the full penalty on each of them. But if we apply the avoidability conception to this case, we get the result that neither is responsible. For neither had an alternative that would have avoided the outcome in question, the target's dying by being shot through the head at that time on that day. If George had decided at the last minute not to shoot, the target would still have been killed by Jeff, and conversely. So how do we fix this? Well, from a practical point of view, the fix is simple. We can simply add an appropriate proviso or amendment. We can say something like, a necessary condition of an agent's being responsible for an outcome is that he or she had an alternative that would have avoided that outcome, except when that outcome is overdetermined, in which case all the agents whose acts jointly overdetermine that outcome are responsible. And that works in practice because we would all agree that in cases like this, both agents should be held responsible. But from a philosopher's point of view, it's not satisfactory at all, for the proviso as it stands is entirely ad hoc. What we need is an overarching, theoretically satisfying rationale that explains and justifies the conclusions we want in both the regular cases and the overdetermination cases. And I'd like to be able to say at this point, I just happen to have such a rationale in my pocket. But alas, I don't. That's the end.
Okay, so we have about 20 minutes for some discussion and questions.
How does your case of Jib and the Indians change if the offer is put, let yourself be the one shot and all 20 will be spared.
Yeah, well, that's of course more personally difficult for Jim himself.
Certainly
Could you
avoids
repeat
moral
the question?
narcissism.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The question is, what would I say if the case were, if the offer were that if Jim allowed himself to be shot, all 20 Indians would be spared? Well, my first reaction would be, it would be very noble of Jim to allow himself to be shot. But that's a supreme sacrifice, and I would be reluctant to say he's morally required to make that sort of sacrifice. It would be very, very noble, but maybe over and beyond the requirements of duty.
When you say that, though, don't you step outside of your analytic frame and you begin to recruit from considerations beyond it. For example, even the choice of the word noble might be said to stand outside the analytic frame and bring in other kinds of consideration.
Well, if by analytic what you mean is thinking of it just as a choice of how many are killed, then yes, it does go beyond that. But many of us would say, well, if you're choosing among other people, there's nothing, other things equal, there's nothing to choose. But we all have a special right to defend ourselves. And so, it would be very good to allow himself to be killed to save the 20 Indians. But would you find him blameworthy if he didn't?
No, but I wouldn't find him a moral narcissist if he did.
Oh, no.
Even
No.
though it could have that motive, because of course he's done an even more superior kind of action.
Right.
And although he can't personally pound his chest in triumph, moral triumph, he can at least allow his family members to do so.
Oh, right. And, yeah, I mean, there are various different specifics you can stipulate. It might be that he's not a happy man, has been considering suicide anyway. He says, okay, the universe is giving me this chance and it has a good result, so I'll do it. Or he might think, well, I've always wanted to be especially virtuous, to perform an act of supererogation, as it's commonly called, and now's my chance to do that. So I will be it's a terrific thing to do, and so I'll do it. But I think he would be most praiseworthy if he didn't think in any terms like that, but just thought, well, this is the only way I can save 20 innocent lives. It's 20 against 1, so what the hell? Shoot me. Yeah.
Me?
Yes.
Yeah. Can I ask 2 questions?
Sure.
Okay.
Well,
All right.
I will see.
There's 3 questions.
Okay. So we talked about moral narcissism.
Right.
So my question is, we have empathy, which could be argued that it is the basis of morality. It's a desire to quench it's a desire to quench the desire to alleviate the pain you get if you don't do good. Isn't empathy the only reason that drives us to be moral? And isn't every moral act by this reasoning a moral narcissism?
If you define empathy that way, which I would not. I mean, you said empathy is the desire to avoid the pain of not doing good.
Right.
I would not think of it that way at all. I would think empathy is genuine concern about others. So you're concerned not about your own pain one way or the other. You're concerned about them, and you do whatever you do for their sake. So if in the example that I gave about Bill being kind to the unfortunate family, if he were really kind, he would do it for their sake, not for the sake of avoiding pain to him or for checking off a box on his virtues chart, but out of genuine concern for those people. Okay, I mean, so you had a second question?
Yeah, second question. So this is how I think utilitarianism by definition quantifies rights and compromises these rights. So I don't know if that's true or not, but like my question is, how can you be an anti-utilitarian while at the same time quantifying rights? Because you said that because you said if he doesn't shoot the one person, he infringes on the right to live for 19 people.
Okay, that's a good question. Of course, what I said depends upon saying 19 deaths are worse than one. And isn't that being a consequentialist of some kind? Those consequences are worse if all 20 died than if just one died. But the question is, what sort of value or principle is involved relating to those consequences? And what I would say is that killing people violates a right, as not killing them doesn't. Okay? So, if you have a case where it's all to do with rights, the right to life in this case, then fewer violations are better than more. And so, yes. But it's not utilitarianism as that is commonly understood, because I would say that our judgments about right and wrong, this is a case where, as John Rawls would put it, right is prior to good. It's not that not killing people has value, it's that it doesn't violate rights. Okay? And if you have a case of rights versus values like happiness, not violating rights comes first. That's a prior requirement. But in this case, since it's all about rights, then of course we can say violating the rights of fewer people is better than violating the rights of more people. Also, I would say, as most anti-utilitarianism, it's not that we have some overarching objection to considering value and how much happiness would be produced or not produced. So we'd be happy to say if you have two alternatives that equally avoid violating rights, so there's no rights issue, then you can choose between those on the basis of which produces the greatest happiness. That's fine. But you don't violate rights for the sake of producing happiness. But that was a very good question. Yeah.
I have a question in relation to justice. What if morality as its framework is more considered in the form of that, of just justice in general? So Jim goes into the forest, he gets offered that thing, he keeps his hands morally clean by refusing to participate in the slaughter of the Indians, and all 20 die. But then he goes back and he finds and he goes back to, say, the UN, and he reports his findings, that sort of thing. In other words, he brings justice onto these guys. Wouldn't that be the morally correct way of viewing it?
Well, in the first place, as I said, I would not say he keeps his hands clean by refusing. I would still say that choice was outrageously wrong in that case. It's, of course, better if he then goes on and tries to
Cleanse it, if you will.
do some recompense, but that, of course, won't restore the lives of the 20 Indians.
Well,
Yeah.
can I add another aspect to that?
Sure.
Well, you then kill the one person saving the 19, and then you come back in the middle of the night and we'll present Jim's Rambo, and he can kill all 20 of these soldiers that have participated in this.
Yeah.
As recompense for the one man.
Yeah, then it becomes complicated.
Yeah.
I mean, then you'd have to ask, I mean, who is worse? The soldiers who were simply following an order,
Yeah.
or the captain who gave the order, or the government that inflicted this policy on the captain who was simply implementing it, and so on.
Okay.
So, I mean,
I might have
yeah,
asked
I
too
mean,
complicated
yeah,
a
no,
question.
that's a good case. And, I mean, what I'd like to say, of course, is he shouldn't shoot them. He should capture them and bring them all back to be tried in a court.
Yeah.
But of course, that might not be possible.
Gotcha.
So, if his only choice is to shoot them all or let the whole thing go, that's difficult.
It seems to me that the inevitability is not warranted because these actions are based on pronouncements, on utterances, and in the consider the case that these same pronouncements are made, but there are hidden strategies or hidden consequences and a bluff involved. For example, if the captain had the hidden consequence of wanting to show himself to be merciful in the face of the violence of Jim. For example, if he would have, if Jim chose to kill the one Indian, he would have let the rest go, killing Jim, showing this visitor to be a violent person, right? And therefore, Jim is the one who has committed the only violence. The captain is the only one. His only failure is having lied, right? But he's also been merciful, letting the Indians go in order to make a point about, I don't know, maybe colonialism or something. But you see how the fact that these are based on utterances rather than a train barreling down a track, that you have control over its lever. You know that case, right? That analogy of the train and the person tied to the track. It seems like that case is very different, not based on utterances, rather based on a more clear, warranted inevitability. Does that make sense?
Okay. If the captain, after Jim shoots, kills Jim and blames Jim for the whole thing, then of course that's not fair to Jim. That's not what he was told. But it still would not change what I would say about what Jim ought to do. I mean, what you're sort of implying is that if Jim had refused, the captain would still have looked for some other excuse to be merciful and would not have killed the 20 Indians. And that makes it similar to what, for example, what a lot of people say about, as an argument against mercy killing or physician-assisted suicide and so on, namely that you never know for sure that you can't be cured. So there was always a chance that the 20 Indians wouldn't be killed, so he should have refused the offer.
So
But
I'm speaking to your case, though.
Right.
I'm speaking to your case. I'm not speaking to
Right.
mercy
But-
killing. I'm speaking to this particular case,
Right.
which seems, if the captain is such that he would make this sort of pronouncement, that seems kind of wild, in my opinion.
I agree.
Then it's, can he be trusted, right? And these are utterances. These are pronouncements. And the trust of these pronouncements that seem to be very significant in this particular case.
Yes, I agree. You have to assume.
But I don't know if that was addressed very well.
No. I was simply assuming that Jim felt he could trust what the captain was saying, and that there was no chance that the captain would let all 20 Indians go if he refused the offer. So Jim was convinced that if he refused the offer, all 20 would die.
So it's his own personal conviction that affects his responsibility?
Well, that's what it was reasonable to believe, let's suppose. I mean, suppose the attitude and manner of the captain and the nature of the situation were such that Jim had no reason to doubt what the captain was saying. He was a very authoritative person. He decided this suddenly. You know, maybe Jim didn't see why he would decide such a thing, but it was pretty clear they'd all die if Jim refused the offer. It's not like a train barreling down a track, but let's say Jim has very good reason to think that's what would happen.
Well, that's a lot of contingencies, it seems to me.
Yeah, but I
inaction might be the best moral decision based on those contingencies.
No, that's where I would get off your bus. Even if it's not 100% certain that all 20 would die. If it's virtually certain or highly, highly probable, then Jim can't get out of it by saying, well, you never know, he might let everybody go anyway. You have to take the probabilities as they are, just as I think you do in cases of physician-assisted suicide or mercy killing. Maybe there's a 1% or 0.1% chance that somebody's cancer will suddenly be cured. But if it's 99.99% probable that it won't and that they'll just suffer unendurable pain, then the mercy killing or the assisted suicide, I think, remains justifiable.
Harry?
Yeah,
Can I
sorry.
follow up on that? Because
Yeah.
it seems to me the problem of contingencies and consequences is a deeper problem, and there's a certain sleight of hand that was performed, and that was to transform this utilitarian argument into a rights argument, but by reframing it away from utility and social utility to individual rights. But you still are in the frame of consequential moral calculations, right?
You're still
You're
still dealing with consequences. And one thing I left out to be kind to all you people is to say that it's a common view that rights have nothing to do with consequences, and I think that's just a mistake. If I shoot a bullet at your head and it goes through your head and you die, I violated your rights because of the consequences of my shot. You died as a consequence of my shot. So rights violations always involve lots of consequences.
But what you discount by doing that is the neo-Kantian constructive argument about deontological obligations. In fact, you never even mention obligations during your talk.
Right.
That we might have an obligation to treat others not as means but as ends.
Right.
And I think that also taps into the argument back here about, what about shouldn't I have an obligation to kill myself to save others? So I mean, I wonder how you address that argument. Are you still not making an argument that there are no such things as these deontological moral obligations imposed on us, and that morality is constructed through consequentialist calculations?
No, I am a great admirer of Kant. I would say, if I had to say whose moral theory my own views are closest to, it would be Kant. But there's a lot of Kant that I don't accept, and one is that we can't have any consideration for consequences. We have to, even in determining our deontological obligations. I'm obligated not to shoot at you because of the consequences thereof, right? I mean, the act of shooting in and of itself is morally neutral, right? So, on the interpretation of him that says we should never consider consequences at all, I don't accept that. But I certainly do accept the view that our first obligation is not to violate rights. After that, we can talk about overall value and maximizing welfare, whatever, but only after that. And I think that gets at what I think of as what is basically right about Kantianism. I don't know whether that really answers.
We can argue about it later. We have time for one more question, probably.
Okay, there are two people with questions. I can see you better, so.
Great, all right. All right, so to kind of veer off, the case of Jim and the Indians, and Carlos and Manuel too, come to think of it, the consequences of the choices are clear. But what if the results of your choices are not clear? So let's say Jim knows where a village of Indians is that the captain did not. The captain finds out about it, so he gives Jim a different ultimatum. Jim could lead them to the village, and they will let all the Indians go, or he can refuse, and that's fine. They'll just kill all 20 Indians. So the results of one choice are clear. All the Indians could die because he refuses. But if he accepts, he doesn't know how many Indians would be in the village or how many would get captured. So the results could be better or worse than
Even in
killing
terms,
20
even if we're
Indians. So-
focusing on rights, yeah.
Yeah, so is it morally reprehensible for him to take that gamble?
You mean to accept the offer, but then lead the
Yeah.
captain to the village?
Yeah.
Of course, in that case, I mean, the result of one choice is clear. 20 Indians die then. Okay. Yeah, so when one result is clear and the other isn't, I mean, I don't know. It depends on a lot more specifics. How many Indians he thinks are in the village, whether the troops will capture them all or just some representatives, whether the Indians are aware of the possibilities and they will trap the soldiers on their way to the village. I mean, all kinds of things come in. And there's no general thing you can say. But if he's convinced that accepting the offer would be worse for the Indians than having him kill 20 then I suppose he should let them kill the 20 then. But it depends on the details and the probabilities, and which he may well not know.
Okay, unfortunately, I think our time is up. Let me thank you all for coming out today, and join me now in thanking Harry for a really interesting conversation.